Well, the future of war is in many respects the future of technology. It's going to be a future in which we are going to see the humans still very much in the loop, but maybe not in the cockpit, not at the controls of the ground vehicle or in the submarine or the ship in space or whatever it may be. We'll see a vast proliferation of what we already have to some degree, which is, of course, unmanned systems, but we're going to see them in every domain of warfare, including in cyberspace. And these machines will be enabled increasingly by machine learning and ultimately by artificial intelligence. We already know from a simulation done by the Department of Defense that a machine, an airplane piloted by artificial intelligence, can defeat in a dogfight an airplane piloted by a human. Now, clearly that artificial intelligence was programmed by, the algorithms were established and designed by humans. But of course, over time, that artificial intelligence capability enabled that system to outperform humans. We've seen this, of course, earlier in chess. We saw it in Go. We saw it in games of civilization building, each of which was increasingly complex. And now, at least in a simulation, we know that a machine enabled by artificial intelligence can outperform a machine piloted by a human. We're going to see that in every single domain. And indeed, in cyberspace as a domain, you're going to see a particularly intense competition, because that is where these various machines, in this case, there'll be racks of servers and switches and computing capability, and perhaps at some point in time, actual quantum computing, they're going to be going at it with each other because they're all going to try to disrupt, to destroy, to take down the systems that are enabling all of these different now unmanned systems, and in some cases, swarms of unmanned systems to operate, to receive the feeds from various sensors that will be providing them information and helping them to make decisions, and systems that are connecting them with communications. Again, all of the different capabilities that are provided to these unmanned systems. Again, the human will still be central to this. There will still be a human in the loop, at least in terms of developing the algorithm, developing the checklist of conditions that must be met before the machine can take a certain action, particularly a kinetic action. And it's very likely that at some point, it's a human who will make the decision to go to a rule of engagement that will be weapons free, where the machine can, in fact, take action based on what it sees in terms of information, perhaps facial recognition, gait recognition, a variety of other factors that will be fed in. And when the conditions are met that were established by the human in the loop, now being in a weapons-free status, the machine will take kinetic or other action. That, I think, is ultimately where we are headed when it comes to conflict. I think that is the future of war, although I don't know how many years, decades it will take to get to that point. But certainly what we already have, just the sheer constellation of drones that we can put over our forces, has transformed the way that we are able to enable our allies and partners on the ground, whether they are the Iraqi security forces and Syrian Democratic forces trying to destroy the caliphate established by the Islamic State, the Afghan National Security Forces trying to fend off the Taliban and extremist elements in Afghanistan, or in Africa, or a variety of other countries around the world. These systems have already changed what we are capable of doing, and they actually have reduced the need very, very dramatically for young men and women in uniform, keeping in mind that I was privileged to command 165,000 Americans in uniform during the surge in Iraq, tens of thousands additional coalition forces also in uniform, and a like number of contractors for that measure. And now with 5,000 or 6,000 US forces on the ground, we were able to enable the Iraqi security forces to eliminate the caliphate established by the Islamic State. That truly is already transformation. And we're going to see much, much more of that, needless to say, ultimately reaching that point that I described, where it may well be unmanned machine against unmanned machine, and may the best artificial intelligence system win.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are honored to be joined here by Representative Jim Banks, Representative Seth Moulton, and Senator Joni Ernst. So the subject of today's discussion is really something sort of at the heart of our current security moment. And we have a few questions here. We'll go right from the beginning. We are nearing the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Reflecting on these last 2 decades, what do you see as the most significant positive lesson from how the US has been fighting wars, as well as the most significant negative or perhaps cautionary lesson from how things have played out?
Great, thank you. And it is very good to be with you. Thank you, Daniel, very much for the work that you do, and of course to the McCain Institute. And I want to thank my colleagues as well for their service, both in uniform and out of uniform, Congressman Jim Banks and Seth Moulton, great thought leaders on Capitol Hill. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. And folks, 20 years has been a very, very long time engaging in the global war on terror. And there are a number of positive aspects that we've seen, a few negative as well. First, I'll start with the positive. Of course, as we've gone through these last several decades, we really have seen advances in technology, certainly in modern warfare, but also on a more global aspect, working with our partners. We have really developed some strong allies through the last 20 years with a constant rotation of forces around the globe. So I would say that that is a positive. Just a cautionary note, though, what we have seen through the last several decades is that we know and understand that terrorism exists, and terrorism is not something that is going away. So always on the lookout, always wary, and always using our allied partners to further our goals around the globe. I would say, again, that's the positive, but cautionary. This is a war that will go on for a very long time in a number of different ways as we fight different cells of terrorists. So once again, thank you very much for the invitation to be here.
Would some of the other panelists want to respond to that particular question about reflecting on 20 years after 9/11 and what our lessons are, particularly those of you who've served, really, and again,
sure,
your service and you've been there.
Sure, I'll just jump in and say, first of all, what an honor it is to be here with 2 fellow veterans. Sometimes it feels like veterans are holding the line in Congress, and I'm particularly grateful to Jim Banks, who is my co-chair on the Future of Defense Task Force. We came out with our report at an incredibly divisive time in American political history, and yet it was fully bipartisan. And that was not easy to do on either side. I'm incredibly grateful to you, Jim, for your leadership and your political courage in getting this done, because it's so important for the future of our national security. So let me respond to this by giving an answer that in some ways answers both parts of the question. Our military has faced an incredible array of quickly evolving challenges over the last 20 years. The face of warfare today is very different than it was during the attacks on 9/11. And even in a conflict like Iraq or Afghanistan, it was amazing how much it changed over the course of our time there. And obviously, we're still there in both places. The U.S. military's ability to adapt to that, our troops' ability to adapt to those changing circumstances is really a positive sign and a good sign for the future. And I just have unending admiration for those who are still out there on the line. But I think the flip side of it is that some of our other whole of government capabilities as a country have eroded. And I often found myself as an infantry Marine in Iraq doing the job of the US State Department because the US State Department wasn't adequately resourced. And that's something that came through loud and clear in our report. I was actually in the first company of Marines into Baghdad, fighting in the invasion, but a few months later, found myself running an Iraqi TV station. I mean, that gives you an idea of the experience that many of us had on the ground that ran the gamut of fighting a war and managing an occupation and trying to bring peace and democracy to a foreign country. But the latter part of that job was not something I was trained for, and the State Department was better, would have been better equipped to handle it. It was an honor to become a minor TV celebrity in Iraq, but that's not what I went there as a United States Marine to do. So I think that there are a couple of lessons in that we should take forward.
And I'll just add, first of all, thank you to the McCain Institute for having us talk about this most important subject today. Senator Ernst, it's always an honor to be with you, and to my friend Seth Moulton. The Banks family sends our regards to the Moulton family. We hope baby Caroline and everyone at home is doing well. As a dad of 3 girls, I can tell you there's nothing better in life. And I know for you, just like me, it's why these issues about America's national security and the future of warfare matter so much, because we have so much at stake at home. When we started this endeavor over a year ago, as we started working on the Future Defense Task Force report, I certainly learned a lot and gained an appreciation for why the last administration at the outset in the National Defense Strategy report named great power competition as our focus, recognizing that while what goes on in the Middle East matters, and why Seth and I both served in Iraq and Afghanistan, why that mattered, but why it was a diversion from tackling the greater great power competition threats that we face, not just on the horizon, but currently. And if I could just unpack that for a moment, one thing that Seth and I learned in the Future Defense Task Force report is about the slow acquisition process that prevents us from developing the emerging technologies that we need to confront, especially China. And in a 2017 Department of Defense internal study, they found that it takes an average of 91 months to move through the process of analyzing the alternatives, defining requirements, and achieving initial operational capability, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence and other related technologies. In contrast, compare that to the commercial sector, where it typically takes 6 to 9 months to execute the development process for software systems like artificial intelligence. As Seth and I unpacked future defense and the China threat, especially, but great power competition, we found troubling statistics like that over and over again. And while in 2017, the Trump administration named great power competition as our significant focus for the Department of Defense, sadly for 4 years, the department did nothing to modernize and change acquisition systems to keep up and change that narrative from that study that I just read you in 2017. It's why I'm hopeful now, again, in a bipartisan way. As Seth mentioned, the Future Defense Task Force was, we had an equal number of Republicans and Democrats on the task force. We in a bipartisan way wrote our report. It's why I'm hopeful that at the outset of a brand new administration, that we can do something to confront the realities that we face and change those troubling bureaucratic processes at the Department of Defense and throughout the entire federal government that prevents us from developing the technologies that we need to confront the threats that we face. So have a lot of thoughts for you, but let me complete my thoughts here initially with a quote from Chris Brose's book, the former staff director to Senator McCain, whose legacy we champion at this institute and at this conference today. On page 103 of his great book, which fell right in line with our work on the Future Defense Task Force report. Chris Brose wrote, because Washington did not sufficiently prioritize hypersonic weapons, US officials now openly concede that China has gotten ahead. Beijing has poured billions of dollars into the specialized wind tunnels and other costly infrastructure that are prerequisites for developing hypersonic weapons. Hypersonic weapons are just one area where we've fallen behind our greatest adversary. There are many other areas as well, and that's why we're glad to talk to you about this important subject today.
Pick up on your point, Representative Banks. The next question I'd like to ask all of you is, what areas of the future of war is the U.S. the least prepared for right now? Hypersonic weapons, you mentioned as one example. And then what can be done about it? And I'm curious, not just only on specific weapons systems, but perhaps on the way in which we conceptualize security and the way in which we prepare ourselves for all the uncertainties that we know lie in the future.
Certainly. And again, a great conversation. And Jim and Seth both reminded me too, it is important on why we focus on what we do and why we do it. When I deployed to Iraq at the beginning of the Iraqi war, pushing supplies from Kuwait up into Iraq, my daughter was 3 years old. You know, if you look over my shoulder, that's a young cadet right there, and she'll be a second lieutenant here in the United States Army in just a little over a year. And this is not her mother's war. So this is very different. And I do anticipate that she will deploy at some point in some theater of operation around the globe. And we have come a long way in a number of areas. We've fallen down in a number of areas. When I first pushed my first convoy into Iraq, we didn't even have maps. No maps. We were running fast and furious and following the flow. Now, what we have to do is continue to develop our technologies to make sure that if my daughter becomes a transportation officer or a quartermaster, that she is better equipped than I was at the beginning of the Iraqi war. So there are a number of areas that we need to continually develop. But as we look to the future, a lot of those technologies are going to shift. As the ranking member of Emerging Threats and Capabilities and the Senate Armed Services Committee, some of the things that we are focused on are obviously hypersonics. It is an area where we are not quite where we need to be when compared to our near-peer competitors like China. Cybersecurity is another area that we really, really need to focus on and determine what is an active war, what is not an active war in the cyber community. Focusing on space as well. We have a brand new space force, and protecting our satellites and that type of infrastructure will be very important. So there's a number of legacy programs that we can start leaving behind, but we have to develop for the war of the future. And hopefully, again, my daughter will face a very different situation, be outfitted properly. As Jim mentioned, the acquisitions process, making sure that it is moving quickly so that we can push the latest and greatest technology to our warriors, whether they're at sea, on the ground, or in the air.
You know, our most important technologies are things that we haven't even developed yet. And if you look at where China is focusing its effort on things like biotech, artificial intelligence, that's really the future of warfare. So, you know, Jim's right. The senator is right that we're behind on hypersonics, but it would be a mistake to just simply look at the places where, you know, we have to catch up with existing weapon systems and not really see where this is all going in the future. And that's why one of our first recommendations in our task force report was to have a Manhattan Project style approach to artificial intelligence. And, you know, Jim insisted on putting in there a requirement that every new weapon system have an artificial intelligence component. That's critical for the future of warfare. We don't even think of biotech in terms of national security right now, except in terms of a very traditional bio threat, as if you know, our adversary were to develop a bioweapon. But actually, biotechnology is going to be used to literally manufacture things in the not too distant future. And if we lose that biotech race to China, a country that's very intent on winning it, then we'll not only be behind in pharmaceuticals and drug development and all the traditional uses of biotechnology, but we'll be behind in national security as well. So Jim, I'm sure you'd love to add to some of this stuff, especially on artificial intelligence, because that's something we got into in great detail.
Yeah, Seth is right. We spent a lot of our time in the Future Defense Task Force report, which, by the way, we recommend reading it. You can find it online. We will find a way to get it out to all the participants in the McCain Institute Sedona conference to give you a chance to take a look at it. And Seth and I would very much appreciate your feedback. Let us know where you think we hit the mark, where we fell short. The report is really we believe groundbreaking in a lot of areas, not just because it's fully bipartisan, but because we make a number of substantive recommendations that Seth and I will be fighting for in not just the upcoming round of NDAA, but in future NDAAs as well. And as Seth said, we put a lot of effort into bringing attention to where we've fallen short on artificial intelligence. I'll just say that back in August, DARPA hosted, and they live streamed it on YouTube, a round robin virtual dogfight tournament. And the tournament was the culmination of a year-long program designed to energize and explore AI algorithms capable of performing simulated within visual range air combat maneuvering, something I'm sure Senator Ernst was paying attention to as well. And in a 5-0 sweep, the AI system overwhelmed the F-16 weapons school pilot. I think we probably all expected an outcome like that, but the domination was so eye-opening that we can't ignore it. That's why, as Seth said on page 7 of the Future Defense Task Force report, in our very first recommendation, we recommend a requirement that all major defense acquisition programs be AI ready and work with existing and planned joint all-domain command and control networks as one of our very first recommendations. You also asked what else can we do about this obvious challenge that we're faced with. And on page 8 of the Future Defense Task Force report, Seth and I also make what we believe is maybe one of the more significant or most important recommendations in our report as well. We recommend that Congress commissioned a RAND Corporation study in a combination with GAO to study legacy platforms and make recommendations to Congress on what legacy platforms are antiquated, outdated, that we should eliminate from a budgetary perspective, so that we can pool resources from those platforms to these emerging technology or artificial intelligence, other technologies that we need to develop as well. So that's where the Future Defense Task Force is most significant. We also made recommendations on how we can develop STEM talent at home, recognizing that China leads the way with STEM graduates, and the United States falls way behind. 2.6 million STEM graduates in India, 4.7 million STEM graduates in China, and in the United States of America, we have 568,000 STEM core graduates currently. So we've fallen way behind. We make recommendations in the report on how we can foster and nurture the talent right here at home to develop these emerging technologies that we need for the future.
I'm so glad that you're drawing attention to this report, because it really is groundbreaking, as you mentioned, and also bipartisan, which has got to be at the core of the whole purpose of the Sedona Forum and the legacy of Senator McCain. Given that we're in an interesting time with the evolution of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the last year has been a devastating time for our country, for our world, it's also, I think, helped us, or should help us, reconceptualize what security means. Who expected a year ago that we would see the sort of harm that's come not from a traditional adversary, of course, but from this disease that's swept the world? So with this in mind, reflecting at this particular moment in the COVID-19 pandemic, what do you think we need to do to understand the idea of security, perhaps in a way that isn't only defined by traditional understandings of defense? And maybe, Senator Ernst, if you could start the conversation.
Yes, thank you. This has been a very tough year, I think, not just for the United States, but for everyone around the globe as we faced the pandemic, and it became a very real threat, not only to our economy, but everything existing within the economy. Our military, our readiness fell as we tried to navigate through training activities, rehearsals, in a pandemic situation. Deploying overseas took on a whole new twist through the pandemic. Focusing on the military readiness became very hard for those at the Pentagon and all around the globe. What we did see through the pandemic, as we had our own struggles, is that China continued to take advantage of the situation. They preyed upon weak economies around the globe. Allied partners that had very little were taken advantage of as China continued to expand with their Belt and Road Initiative. They developed new ports, took on new activities around the globe that in a scale that we had not seen before. So not only did we need to pay attention to our own military readiness and fighting the pandemic and caring for our own citizens, but we had to have an awareness of what was going on with our adversaries, not just militarily, but through economic means as well. So this is really, I think, opened our eyes to the fact that we have to continue to pay attention on all fronts. Not just with our own military readiness, but what is going on with our adversaries. We've seen Russia and China expand into South America. We see them in Africa. We see them all over again. So continuing to push back on that will continue to be very important in the future. And we need to absolutely make sure that we are taking care of our own national security. Our weak southern border has really provided an advantage to our adversaries. We see multiple countries pushing immigrants over our southern border, and we have got to wake up. We have got to wake up and pay attention to this crisis. I think so far we've logged over 54 countries that have sent immigrants over the southern border. Not all of them are friendly. We have folks coming from Yemen. We have folks coming from Iran. We have folks coming from China, and I could go on and on and on. So the pandemic has really brought us to not a screeching halt, but at a point where we need to wake up and really pay attention to our national security.
Yeah, so I'll just chime in. I wholeheartedly agree with the first part of what the senator said, because she's absolutely right. I mean, China has totally taken advantage of this. They've expanded their Belt and Road Initiative. They've really capitalized on the pandemic in ways that we were unprepared for. And, you know, their whole Belt and Road Initiative is not a unique concept. I mean, they're essentially expanding on our Marshall Plan for Western Europe. But the point is that we don't just need to be aware of this, we've got to have a response. We can't just be aware of the fact that China is taking over Africa. We've got to work to counter it and shore up our alliances in that region and push back against their naval expansion. I mean, they're even expanding right along this Panama Canal in our backyard with purchasing property and positioning, I would say, commercial interests for future military use. So we have got to have a serious whole of government response to this. It's not something that can just be handled by our military, which gets back to some of the recommendations that we made in the report. The one thing I would point out is that when you talk about people coming to the United States from places like China and Iran, I mean, by and large, these are refugees. These are people who are coming here because they do not like the oppressive governments of China or Iran. And we've got to make sure we have a sensible immigration policy that supports and embraces people who want to come here for the right reasons, while also ensuring that nobody comes here and gets through for the wrong reasons. Part of that with regards to Central and South America is actually having a foreign policy that deals with some of the problems that are inspiring these refugees to come in the first place. I mean, I understand when someone is facing death for her kids from gangs in a place like Guatemala and wants to take care of her kids. I understand that as a father myself, and sees the only option is coming to America. It's incumbent upon us, if we don't want tides of refugees coming across our southern border, to recognize the root causes of these problems and actually have a policy to do something about that. And that's something that I hope we can work with the new administration on in a really proactive, productive, and bipartisan way.
Let me just add, again, another commercial for Chris Brose's book, Kill Chain, because I think it, better than anything else I have ever read, explains China's civil military fusion approach and versus our very inadequate lack of a whole of government approach to combating it. And of course, there are ethical standards on our side that don't exist on their side. Their way of their government and way of life is different than ours. We recognize that, but I think better than anything I've ever read, Chris Brose sums this up, their approach versus our approach up better than anything that I've ever read in his book, Kill Chain. And I'll give you another commercial for another book that just came out last week. Josh Rogan from the Washington Post, Chaos Under Heaven, is a seminal read when it comes to this subject and understanding the last 4 years, understanding all of this through the lens of the pandemic, and where we really fell short over the last 4 years in addressing and confronting the China threat, both militarily and economically, at a time when the American people are more awakened to this challenge and the existential threat that China poses to the United States and our way of life in America, for not just now, but for future generations, in a way that we have to approach. So, Kill Chain by Chris Brose and Chaos Under Heaven by Josh Rogan from the Washington Post. Read them, and you'll thank me when you do.
Let me just chime in here to offer my praise for Chris Brose, because I don't want to be the only one. I won't want Jim to be the only one advertising his wisdom, which in such great part, of course, flowed from the late senator. He was immensely helpful to our task force, and as Jim said, very much was thinking along the same lines as the conclusions that we reached. And he spoke often about how one of the most important things that Senator McCain did was continually challenge the military to question its assumptions and to move forward, to not be tied to legacy systems, but to be constantly asking, how do we change for the future to meet the threats over the horizon? And that's exactly what we tried to do with our task force. But we also, I think, have already come face to face with how challenging this is. And there was once when I went to Chris Brose and just asked him, how did the senator handle the pushback from colleagues on the Hill, the pushback from the Department of Defense when you try to move them in the right direction and there's so much inertia? I won't get into the long answer he gave, but the wisdom that still flows from Senator McCain through Chris and others is immensely helpful to us in national security circles as we try to evolve to meet these future threats.
So you touch on one of the most complicated issues in all of management of our security challenges, given that the U.S. currently spends a lot of money on defense. By some accounts, spends as much as the next 10 countries below, given the understanding that some numbers on China are a little tricky to come by. So the U.S. spends a lot on defense. Other than spending more money, what do you feel are the strategies and the ways in which you can help move Congress towards specific answers that don't just involve more money, but perhaps involve spending money in a way that yields a more effective preparation for whatever the future of war holds?
This is an issue within the Pentagon, and making sure that we continue to focus forward and not invest heavily in legacy programs that won't meet our objectives of modern warfare. Of course, one of the issues that I have had and we have focused heavily on is making sure that the Pentagon can complete a full audit. They have not yet had a clean audit, and honest to goodness, they can't tell you where all of their money is going. So this is an issue that we have to focus on. We do not want a flat defense budget. I think that is very harmful to our Department of Defense. But at the same time, we need to make sure that those taxpayer dollars that we are investing are being used judiciously. So everybody's, hollering out for Chris Bros. I'm going to do it too. I enjoyed working with Chris very much, and we've had many discussions about our acquisitions process. When you have countries that have state-sponsored industry like China, they can adapt and produce very quickly to a changing environment. When the United States government spends years upon years upon years to simply procure a new personal weapon for members of the Army, you can see where we can fall behind. So we have to move quickly through acquisitions and working with our own industrial base. But just because we've always invested in programs with certain companies doesn't mean we should continue to do that in the future. We have to have competitions. We have to make sure that we're moving quickly. And if that involves off-the-shelf products that can be adapted to our military, then so be it. There are so many things that we can do to improve our responsiveness, but again, be very judicious with our taxpayer dollars that we are investing in our men and women of the United States Armed Forces.
Jim mentioned the study that we called for in our task force report for an impartial group to come in and say, what do we need and what do we need to cut? Because the reality is that regardless of whether defense budgets continue to tick up or stay flat or go a little bit down, there's no question that we cannot meet future threats without freeing up significant money from old systems. And I think that one of the other important points that we came to is that it's not enough just to say, oh, this is a legacy system. It's been around for a long time. It's no good. I mean, you could argue, for example, that the B-52 is still pretty good at its mission, and talk about a legacy system. I mean, it's been around for an awful long time. But to really say, what are the future operational concepts that we will need? What does the future of warfare really look like? And to the senator's point, let's have competitions here, not just competitions between industry, which absolutely needs to happen, but also more wargaming, more simulated competitions with our adversaries, so we truly understand what are the capabilities that we need, and then go to our industrial base and say, this is what we need. You need to either provide it off the shelf or develop it, but not the other way around. Not say, oh, go ahead and develop a whole bunch of technologies and then we'll decide and try to figure out how to use them. So that's something that we need to do a lot more of. And it's something that Chris, again, addresses very specifically in his book.
Yeah, just to add, a predictable budget for the DoD is fundamentally important when it comes to investing in innovation and investing in emerging technologies. Many of us believe that a 3 to 5% increase not adjusted, but above inflation is fundamentally important to that predictability for the department. And we'll continue to, I believe there's bipartisan support for that. If not a flatline budget of many of us believe a 3 to 5% above inflation increase in the budget is what's necessary. But just in case Chris Bros isn't embarrassed enough about all the lavishing of praise on him, I want to quote him one more time. On page 23 of his book, Kill Chain, he writes, from 1990 to 2017, the Chinese military budget increased by 900%. China has devised strategies not to beat America at its own game, but to play a different game. And that's why the Future Defense Task Force report is so important, because it's all about how do we foster the innovation that we need to develop the new technologies that Seth talked about a little bit ago, the technologies that we can't even fathom today. How do we innovate and develop those technologies? I believe it's attitudinal. And so far, we haven't had the attitude at the highest levels in the Pentagon to foster and nurture that type of reform that's necessary. I recently had a beer with Matt Lampert, who also worked for Senator McCain. And I was struck by something that he told me about Senator McCain that I didn't know. I hadn't heard this from anybody else, but he said that every time the senator would rally the staff, and every time they would have a meeting about Senate Armed Services Committee work, at the end of the meeting, Senator McCain would pump his fist in the air and chant, reform, reform, reform. That's the attitude that we need in Congress today more than ever, not just for reform, but I believe now Seth and I are raising our fists in the air and chanting, innovate, innovate, innovate. That's the type of attitude that we need at the highest levels of the Pentagon. That's the type of attitude that we need among our leaders in Congress, especially in the Armed Services Committee. It's definitely the type of attitude that we need in the Commander-in-Chief as well. And so far, we've fallen short of that attitude, but Seth and I are trying to nurture a new movement to foster that type of attitude moving forward.
Thank you so much for those responses. I mean, you really bring up a key issue here, which is most of the most impressive and transformational innovations that we've seen, say, technologically in the last number of years many have come out of the United States, as we know, but most of them have been driven by private industry, driven to innovate, but not really because of incentives that Congress or the US government have presented. So, given the demand and need for innovation at all levels, what do you think Congress can do to build partnerships with major corporations, with universities and other innovators, and also create fundamental, meaningful incentives that would deepen this partnership and push innovation in the direction that meets US national security needs?
Yeah, I'm going to join Seth and Jim and pumping my fist and say innovate, innovate, innovate. I think it is very important, and developing those relationships with not just our major hardware providers. You know, you have a lot of industries out there that have been providing products and services to the Department of Defense for many, many years, but we have many smaller scale providers that we should be including in various competitions and making sure that that they have opportunity to compete for those contracts with the Department of Defense. So I do think it's very important. Some of these companies, you'll find them in Silicon Valley, in California. You might even find them right here in the Midwest in Iowa. They need to have the availability. They need to know how to navigate our system of acquisitions at the Department of Defense and be allowed to participate. I think that's very, very important. But we have to recognize that while we're investing in hypersonics and artificial intelligence, cyber capabilities, I always do go back to the soft troops, our special operations forces. And number one, humans are more important than hardware. So while we continue to invest in new innovations, new technologies, we have to make sure that we continue to invest in our men and women within the service as well, because they are the ones, they are the operators, they are going to be operating those systems and technologies. So we can't forget that while we are invested in modernizing the way we do business within the Pentagon, that we have to continually recruit the best and the brightest of our young men and women across the United States.
You know, one of the debates that we expected to engage in as part of our task force research was whether the solution to this technology deficit was simply to double down on private industry and make sure we're adopting more technologies more quickly from the private sector, or whether there needed to be more government investment in basic scientific research. And it turned out that our conclusion was quite clear. It's not an either or. It's got to be both. There is early stage research and development that is so risky, those risks can only be borne by the government, and we need to reinforce that. And so we called for an increase in basic scientific research, and as Jim mentioned earlier, an increase in focusing on STEM talent development. But at the same time, we clearly need to be able to work with industry more closely and adopt off-the-shelf technologies, because it is a private industry that in so many ways has been leading the way. There's actually an interesting example just from home here in Massachusetts, which is home to many of the biotech companies that have been developing vaccines for COVID-19. And we had one of the Republican witnesses on the budget committee, which I also served, came in and talked about how it was private pharmaceutical companies that innovated so quickly to develop these vaccines in absolute record time. But they are all resting on the academic centers in places like Boston and Cambridge, which are mostly funded by government research contracts to develop the underlying technologies that enable these companies, many of them relatively new, to develop vaccines so quickly. And you can apply that to the national security situation as well. So we have to do both. It's not an either or, and that's another thing that came through loud and clear in our report.
I'll add just quickly that before I began this work with Seth and the Future Defense Task Force, I didn't know a whole lot about DIU and programs like Naval X and AFWorks. When I was introduced to those programs, I learned quickly that they're very effective. They work. They deserve our support on the Armed Services Committee. Oftentimes, I've been skeptical of bureaucratic programs like that, but after visiting both Silicon Valley and in Boston with Seth to look at the DIU efforts there to spur innovation and entrepreneurship among emerging entrepreneurs who are bringing new ideas and technologies into the fold. These are exactly the type of programs that we need to protect and nurture. Seth also took me to Kessel Run, which is an Air Force coding unit in downtown Boston. And you have to see it to believe it. I mean, it is again, to get back to this being an attitudinal shift in our paradigm. It's nurturing programs like these that invest in our own people who are developing new software, new technologies. That's what it's going to take.
It's such a great point, Jim, and it really ties back to a point that the senator made, which is how important it is to invest in our people. I thought one of the most inspiring things that I saw at Kessel Run was how devoted to our national security, how devoted to serving our country these young scientists and engineers were. Straight out of places like Stanford, many of them just in their early to mid 20s, who were solving problems for the Air Force in, I don't know, 1/10 the time and at 1/100th the cost as the big defense contractors. And they really believed they were doing it for the good of the nation. And it pointed out that there are, when we think about this whole of government approach to security, we've also got to inspire more young people to serve in different ways, not just in traditional ways in the military. Although obviously being a second lieutenant in the Army, like the senator's proud daughter, is always going to be important as well.
So I just want to give all of you a chance for some concluding comments. Really, what issue have we not covered that's dear to your heart related to how the U.S. can effectively prepare for whatever the future of war might bring us?
Yes, and once again, Daniel, I just want to thank the McCain Institute and my colleagues, Seth and Jim, and I'm so glad to be on this panel with these two tremendous warriors. And one area that I am particularly devoted to, again, is Special Operations Forces, as I serve as the ranking member on the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee. We do tend to focus on not only our technologies, but those that will be utilizing some of these newer technologies as well. What we see is not just our conventional forces that are engaging around the globe, but we see a footprint, a much smaller footprint in many of the areas, such as Africa, South America, the Philippines, throughout Europe, in Afghanistan, and of course, Iraq, where we have special operations forces that are engaging with communities and developing skills and techniques so that our allied nations and partners can further support their own interests around the globe. So continuing to invest in our SOF is very important, even when we see challenging times with our Department of Defense budget. These are consumers of a very small portion of the overall DoD budget, yet the bang for the buck is pretty darn tremendous. They are warriors who will operate in the gray zone, just short of armed conflict. And oftentimes, if we utilize them properly, we can completely deflect the need for conventional forces. So as we look to modern warfare and any conflict of the future, we need to continue to remember that we can utilize these small, elite, specialized forces to hopefully prevent future conflict.
So I'll just take a cue from the senator, and I've had the privilege of working with a number of soft troops on the ground in Iraq and seeing what she describes firsthand. But to step back even a little bit further, there are a lot of conflicts that wouldn't even reach the stage of having to involve soft troops if we invested more in diplomacy. And there's no one who understands the importance of organizations like the State Department and USAID better than troops like myself who've had to operate in this gray zone and rely on civilian counterparts for our national security. But one of the points that came through in the report is not just this, the fact that is a fact that's perhaps best summarized by Secretary and formerly General Mattis, who said, if you want to cut the State Department budget, you're going to have to buy me more ammunition. It's also the fact that we need to be thinking forward about what sorts of big picture alliances we need to meet the future threats. We've worked for a long time on developing alliances in Europe, but not as much time has been spent developing alliances in the Pacific. And obviously China is the big threat that we face. And also what sorts of treaties do we need to pursue that will ultimately be not just good for peace and security the world over, but will enhance our position in national security. And this is a place, again, where artificial intelligence comes up, because we are a different society than China. We do believe in human rights. We do have a constitution that we respect, that preserves human freedoms. And if we want rules of the road for the use of artificial intelligence to follow our values, then we need to be the ones who develop this technology and set the standards for its use. We can't leave that up to China. So it's all the more reason why we need to invest in organizations like the State Department and the diplomatic work that the broader U.S. government does, not just in a traditional sense to prevent conflicts from happening, although that's always going to be important, but also in a real future-looking sense to anticipate how we position ourselves as a nation to make sure that we always are on a winning side. That, as General Dunford, former Commandant of the Marine Corps, likes to say, we never send our troops into a fair fight. We always have the advantage.
Likewise, I want to thank the McCain Institute for allowing us to be a part of this event. To carry on Senator McCain's legacy, especially as related to reform and national security, and participate in this event is one of the honors of my time in service. His legacy is significant even today, and very proud to be with all of you at the McCain Institute. I'm glad Seth brought up that last point, and on as related to Senator McCain. I'll never forget going with you, Seth, to going abroad and being in Hanoi at the John McCain Monument where he was shot down, and traveling throughout Vietnam, Cambodia, throughout Southeast Asia, and recognizing quickly how far we have slipped, how far we've gone in just a matter of a short amount of time in seeding these relationships and allowing China to fill a vacuum where America has diminished. And to confront the China threat, we need those allies. We need Vietnam to choose America in our interest and our mutual interest with Vietnam versus the interest of China. Yet in almost every case, from Vietnam to Cambodia to Thailand and elsewhere, we've seen China step up and fill the shoes that America used to wear. And that puts us in a dangerous situation. And we Seth and I, we dig into this in the Future Defense Task Force report and talk about ways that we can restore those strategic alliances and partnerships, not just in Southeast Asia, but around the world. And I'll leave you with one final thought. Our very first hearing in the Future Defense Task Force, we had former Senator Jim Talent and Michelle Flournoy speak to us. And I'll never forget their takeaway as well, was that we have to reinvent a posture, and this is really Congress's job and the oversight role to allow the Pentagon to take more risk and not be afraid of failing, coming back hat in hand and explaining themselves to members of Congress. In fact, this is where a new generation of leaders like Seth and myself and Senator Ernst and others, where we should be slapping the Pentagon on the back every time they take warranted risk, sometimes failing, because it's those risks that are necessary to develop the future technologies, the future efforts, the ideas, and the attitude that we need to confront the threats that we face as we develop the future of warfare. So once again, it's a privilege to be with all of you. Thank you for letting us talk about this most important subject.
On behalf of the McCain Institute, I want to thank our extraordinary panel. I can't think of a more appropriate panel to discuss the ways in which we can help guide U.S. policy to address the future of war. Thank you so much, Senator Joni Ernst, Representative Jim Banks, and Representative Seth Moulton. It's really been a pleasure speaking with all of you today. Thank you.